The last thing Gunther Stoll ever wrote was a word that does not exist. It was 10:45 p.m. on October 25, 1984. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his home in Anshausen, West Germany, a small village of perhaps 600 people. His wife was preparing for bed. He had been quiet for most of the evening, which was not unusual. For months, he had spoken in fragments, references to them, warnings that something was coming, fears that he could not fully articulate. Then he sat upright. His pen touched the paper. He wrote 6 characters. He crossed them out immediately, so violently that the ink bled through to the tablecloth beneath. His wife asked what was wrong. He did not answer. He stood, walked to the door, and drove into the night. For hours later, he was found naked, bleeding, and conscious in the passenger seat of his wrecked Volkswagen, 100 kilometers from home. He told the men who discovered him that he had been with 4 individuals. He said they were not his friends. He died before paramedics could get him to the hospital. The piece of paper was never entered into evidence. His wife, in grief and confusion, threw it away. The only record of those 6 characters is her memory, and her memory is not certain. It might have been YOGTZ. It might have been YOGTZ. It might have been YO6TZ. 40 years later, no one knows what it means. No one knows who the 4 men were. No one knows why his body was moved from the site of his initial injury to the location where he was found. No one knows why his clothes were removed. No one knows what he discovered in the moment he shouted, asterisk, "Now I've got it!" Asterisk, the German phrase, "Jetzt geht mir ein Licht auf," and wrote those impossible letters on a sheet of paper that no longer exists. This case would remain unsolved for 40 years. Not because of a lack of evidence, but because of one detail everyone overlooked. The 6 characters were not a message. They were a reaction. Something had just become visible to him. And whatever it was, it got him killed within 4 hours. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what went wrong in 5 investigations, and why, in each of them, the absence of a comprehensible motive may be the most important piece of evidence we have. This is Behind the Crime Files, where we explore the true stories behind the crimes, the psychology, and the motives that investigators couldn't explain. Case 1. The Salish Sea Feet. Jedediah Island, British Columbia, is not the kind of place where you expect to find evidence of a crime. In August 2007, it was, and remains, a provincial marine park accessible only by boat. Douglas firs line the rocky shoreline. Seals haul themselves onto the beaches. The water of the Strait of Georgia is cold enough that even in summer, prolonged immersion carries risk of hypothermia. It is beautiful, remote, and largely undisturbed by human activity. On the morning of August 20th, a 12-year-old girl was walking the shoreline while her family prepared lunch on their boat. She noticed a blue and white Adidas sneaker wedged between 2 rocks, half submerged in a tidal pool. Later, she would tell reporters that her first thought was someone had been careless with their garbage. She picked it up by the laces. Inside was a human right foot. The bone at the ankle terminated in a clean, slightly irregular edge, consistent with separation at the joint. The skin was pale and waterlogged. The shoe was a men's size 12. It had been in the water approximately 2 weeks. No one expected that afternoon to be different. No one expected to find a foot. On August 26, 2007, 6 days later, a couple walking on Gabriola Island, approximately 30 miles southeast, discovered another sneaker. This one was a black and white Reebok. It contained another human right foot. It was also a men's size 12. The decomposition rate suggested it had entered the water approximately 3 months earlier. At first, it didn't seem alarming. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police issued a brief statement. Corporal Gary Cox told reporters that finding 1 foot was 1,000,000 to 1 odds. But finding 2 feet from 2 different individuals in the same week was simply crazy. Investigators assumed the 2 cases were unrelated, coincidences of tide and tragedy. Then, on February 8, 2008, a 3rd right foot washed ashore on Valdez Island. Size 11. On May 22nd, a 4th right foot, this one female, was found on Kirkland Island, still laced into a New Balance sneaker. On June 16, two hikers on Westham Island discovered the first left foot. DNA testing later confirmed it matched the right foot found on Valdez Island. On August 1, a camper in Piesch, Washington, the first American discovery, found a male right foot inside a black size 11 shoe. By the end of 2008, 7 feet had been recovered. All but one were right feet. None formed a matching pair at the time of discovery. The media called it a serial killer. The public called it a mafia dumping ground. Online forums suggested aliens, animal attacks, industrial accidents, and a dozen other theories, each more elaborate than the last. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. All of the recovered feet were wearing socks. Not all of them were wearing matching socks. Not all of them were wearing new socks. But every single foot that washed ashore between 2007 and 2019, all 21 confirmed discoveries, was discovered with its socks still in place, often tucked neatly inside the shoe. At the time, this detail was dismissed as insignificant. Bodies decompose in water. Skin becomes slippery. Socks adhere to macerated tissue. It made sense that they would remain attached. Later, it would become impossible to ignore that socks do not adhere to bone. They adhere to flesh. And the flesh of the ankle and heel, in cases of prolonged submersion, is among the first tissue to degrade or be consumed by marine scavengers. The feet that washed ashore were not skeletonized. They retained soft tissue. They retained their socks. This is not what happens to a body that has been in the water for months. Criminal psychologists who later examined the Salish Sea evidence files focused on one specific behavioral detail: the footwear. Of the 21 feet recovered between 2007 and 2019, 17 were wearing modern athletic shoes, running shoes, cross-trainers, hiking sneakers. 3 were in work boots. 1 was in a leather loafer. Gail Anderson, a forensic entomologist at Simon Fraser University, had been studying body decomposition in the very waters where the feet were found. In 2007, her research team had demonstrated that deep-dwelling fish, shrimp, and crustaceans could reduce a human corpse to a skeleton in under 4 days. The process was not random. Scavengers target soft tissue first: the face, the abdomen, the hands. They also target the ankles. The tibio-talar joint, where the foot meets the leg, is a point of vulnerability. Once the soft tissue is consumed, the foot separates. But Anderson noted something important about the recovered feet. They were not being consumed. They were being preserved. This wasn't panic, she later explained. This was a change in the evidence itself. The feet that washed ashore were buoyant, not because of any biological property, but because of the shoes. Modern running shoes, manufactured after approximately 2000, contain air pockets and lightweight foam that act as flotation devices. Older shoes, leather boots, dress shoes, sandals, sink. They remain on the seafloor, where scavengers consume them completely. This wasn't a serial killer. This was a statistical inevitability. The feet kept appearing because the shoes kept floating. But the most disturbing part was still to come. By 2019, the British Columbia Coroner's Service had identified 11 of the individuals whose feet had washed ashore. They were not victims of foul play. They were not homicide victims. They were people who had drowned, jumped from bridges, or gone missing from fishing vessels and recreational boats. One man had been missing since 1987. His foot appeared in a running shoe in 2011, 24 years after his death. The families of these individuals received something that families of the missing rarely receive: confirmation. DNA testing linked the recovered remains to the missing persons files. A fisherman lost at sea in 2004. A woman who jumped from a bridge in 2008. A man suffering from depression who walked into the water in 2003. They received closure. But they also received questions. Why only the foot? Why only the shoe? Why, in several cases, was the recovered footwear different from what the victim was last seen wearing? The coroner's office had no answers. The case files remained open, but the investigation was effectively complete. This is where the story takes a darker turn. In 2023, a 24th foot washed ashore on Gonzales Beach in Victoria, British Columbia. It was wearing a running shoe. It had been in the water approximately 2 weeks. The coroner confirmed that all individuals associated with the recovered remains had now been identified. The case was closed. But the phenomenon continues. The truth was far more mundane than anyone expected. This wasn't a crime. It was a consequence. Changes in footwear manufacturing, combined with the aggressive scavenging patterns of marine life in the Salish Sea, created a perfect forensic storm. Bodies that entered the water sank to the bottom. Scavengers consumed the soft tissue, separating the feet at the ankle. The feet, buoyed by air pockets in modern running shoes, floated to the surface. Prevailing westerly winds and tidal currents carried them to the same beaches, year after year. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't impulsive. It was predictable. The Salish Sea case left behind more questions than answers. For the families of the identified victims, the recovery of a foot brought both resolution and a new, quieter grief. They had spent years imagining their loved ones somewhere, alive perhaps or at least whole. The foot, delivered by tide and chance, replaced imagination with evidence. It was real. It was partial. It was all that remained. For the families of the unidentified, the 10 individuals whose feet matched no missing person file, there was not even that much. Someone, somewhere, may still be waiting for them to come home. They may never know that part of their loved one washed ashore on a beach in British Columbia and was buried in an unmarked grave. For the investigators, the coroners, the forensic experts who spent 15 years explaining to the public that the feet were not evidence of murder, the case became a lesson in the limits of intuition. "It's sad but true," Coroner Barb McClintock told reporters. "A lot of this is simply the quelling of the public imagination. To say, no, this is unfortunate and they're all very sad cases. The feet keep washing ashore. The shoes keep floating. The sea keeps giving back what it took." Case 2. The Cape Intruder. Cape Elizabeth, Maine, is the kind of town that appears in tourism brochures and retirement planning guides. Population approximately 9,000. Median income well above the state average. Crime rate so low that the police department's annual reports often contain more pages about traffic enforcement than criminal investigation. In 2005, Mary C. was a divorced schoolteacher in her late 40s. She lived alone in a gray colonial house on Shore Road, within sight of the Portland Head Light, the oldest lighthouse in Maine. She kept geraniums on her porch, library books on her nightstand, and her front door unlocked. No one expected that night to be different. On the night of August 8, 2005, at approximately 2 a.m., a retired lobsterman named Harold woke to find a young man standing beside his bed. The man was approximately 3 feet from Harold's sleeping wife. He was standing perfectly still, his weight balanced evenly on both feet, his hands at his sides. Harold shouted. The man turned, walked calmly through the living room, opened the front door, and departed. Harold, who was 73 and used a cane, did not pursue. First, it didn't seem alarming. Harold reported the incident to police. They took a statement, checked the perimeter, found no evidence of forced entry, and filed the report. There was nothing to investigate. 6 weeks later, a 31-year-old real estate agent named Jennifer reported a similar incident. She had woken at 3 a.m. to find a man standing in her bedroom doorway, partially silhouetted against the hall light. She described his posture as patient. He left when she turned on her lamp. By December 2005, 5 more residents had reported waking to find a stranger standing over their beds. All described the same physical features. Male, early 20s, slim build, dark hair, dark hooded sweatshirt, light-colored athletic pants, running shoes. All reported that he did not speak, did not touch them, did not take anything. He stood, observed, and departed. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. 2 victims, Harold and Jennifer, independently identified the same local resident as matching the intruder's description. They did not know each other. They were interviewed separately weeks apart. Both named the same man, a 24-year-old Cape Elizabeth native who worked at a hardware store and lived with his parents. At the time, this convergence was dismissed as coincidence. The suspect had no criminal record. He provided alibis for several of the reported intrusion dates. His alibis were verified. He was released. Later, it would become impossible to ignore that two strangers, separated by age, gender, and occupation, had looked at a composite sketch and arrived at the same name. Criminal psychologists who later studied the Cape Intruder case focused on one behavioral detail: the absence of flight response. Home intruders, even those who do not intend violence, exhibit predictable physiological responses upon discovery. Heart rate spikes. Adrenaline floods the system. The body prepares for confrontation or escape. This is not a choice. It is the autonomic nervous system responding to threat. The Cape Intruder did not exhibit any of these responses. He stood, behavioral analysts noted, not frozen, not startled. He stood in a balanced, weight-distributed stance, arms at sides, facing the victim directly. This is not the posture of a person caught. This is the posture of a person who has arrived at his destination. Several victims reported that the intruder's gaze was not fixed on them but moved slowly across the room. The furniture, the objects on nightstands, the arrangement of personal items. One victim said he seemed to be looking at everything except me. This wasn't intrusion. This was observation. Investigators focused their attention on the man identified by Harold and Jennifer. On paper, it made sense. He was young. He lived locally. He matched witness descriptions. He had been named by two independent victims before the composite sketch was released to the public. But something didn't add up. The suspect worked full-time at a hardware store. His shifts were documented. His co-workers confirmed his presence during the hours when several intrusions occurred. He had no vehicle, no driver's license, and lived within walking distance of his workplace, but not within walking distance of the victims' homes, which were distributed across a 6-mile radius. Detective Frank O'Malley spent 3 weeks trying to reconcile the evidence with the suspect's alibi. He could not. The case went cold. But the most disturbing part was still to come. In February 2006, a family on Sawyer Road returned from a weekend trip to find evidence that someone had been living in their house. Pillows had been rearranged. A half-empty glass of water sat on the kitchen counter. The television remote was not on its charging dock. The front door, which they had locked, was now unlocked. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was damaged. But someone had occupied their home for approximately 48 hours. The responding officer checked the bedrooms. All beds were made. The master bath showed signs of use. A damp towel, a slightly reduced roll of toilet paper. The children's rooms were untouched. Then the officer opened the linen closet. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Wedged between stacks of towels was a small notebook. The cover was plain black, unmarked. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, dates, times, names, the names of every Cape Intruder victim, and next to each name, a detailed description of the interior of their home. Everything changed when the notebook was examined by forensic document analysts. The handwriting did not match the suspect identified by Harold and Jennifer. It did not match any known individual in the Cape Elizabeth Police Department's database. It contained information that could only have been obtained through direct, extended observation, the arrangement of furniture, the titles of books on nightstands, the brands of appliances in kitchens, the patterns of family photographs on walls. The intruder was not breaking in at random. He was not selecting victims based on opportunity or proximity. He was returning to the same homes repeatedly over periods of weeks or months. He was learning the residents' schedules, their habits, their private domestic rhythms. He was not looking for something to take. He was looking for something to see. The truth was far more ordinary than anyone expected. In June 2006, the intrusions stopped. Not gradually, not with a final incident that investigators could point to as the conclusion. They simply ceased. The Cape Intruder, whoever he was, disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. The notebook was never claimed. The handwriting was never matched. The suspect identified by Harold and Jennifer continued to live in Cape Elizabeth, continued to work at the hardware store, continued to deny any involvement. Without evidence linking him to the notebook or the intrusions, there was no basis for arrest. This wasn't a predator. This was a neighbor. The psychological profile, commissioned by Detective O'Malley but never released to the public, described the intruder as follows. Subject is likely male, aged 18 to 25, resident of the immediate area. Subject demonstrates no evidence of antisocial personality disorder. No history of violence. No criminal record. Subject's behavior indicates voyeuristic compulsion, not predatory intent. Subject seeks proximity to domestic environments, not contact with occupants. When confronted, subject does not react with aggression or panic because he does not perceive himself as threatening. He perceives himself as observing. He has likely been doing this since adolescence. Subject is probably known to the community. Subject may be perceived as unremarkable, quiet, possibly shy. Subject may have difficulty forming intimate relationships and compensates through vicarious observation of domestic life. Subject does not understand why his behavior is criminal. To him, watching is not the same as harming. Subject will stop when his needs are met elsewhere. This may occur through relocation, relationship formation, or psychological intervention. If his needs are not met, he will resume. The intrusions never resumed. The Cape intruder case left behind more questions than answers. For the 7 confirmed victims, the passage of years did not erase the memory of waking to find a stranger standing over their bed. Harold died in 2018. Jennifer moved to California. Mary sold her colonial house and relocated to an assisted living facility, where she requested and received a room on the 3rd floor. For the suspect who was questioned and released, the investigation left a permanent stain. Though never charged, his name circulated through local gossip networks for years. He eventually left Cape Elizabeth. His current whereabouts are unknown. For Detective O'Malley, the case became a professional obsession. He retired in 2015 but continued reviewing the files from his home office. In 2020, he told a reporter that he believed the intruder was still alive, still living an ordinary life in an ordinary town, still aware of what he had done. I think about him every day, O'Malley said. Not because I want to arrest him. He's not dangerous. He never was. I think about him because I want to know what changed. What happened in June 2006 that made him stop? Did he meet someone? Did he move? Did he just grow up? He paused. Or is he still doing it? Somewhere else? And we just haven't heard about it yet? Case 3. The Monster with 21 Faces. Nishinomiya, Japan, is an affluent city between Osaka and Kobe. In 1984, it was home to Katsuhisa Izaki, 58-year-old president of the Izaki Glico Company, manufacturer of Japan's most popular confectionery products. Glico caramel, Pocky sticks, almond chocolate, these were not merely products. They were cultural institutions. Mr. Izaki lived with his wife and children in a large house on a compound that also contained his mother's residence. The property was surrounded by a brick wall. Security systems were installed. By all accounts, life was ordinary, predictable, safe. No one expected that night to be different. On the evening of March 18, 1984, at approximately 9 p.m., 2 men in police uniforms knocked on the door of Yoshi Izaki's home. She was 70 years old, Katsuhisa's mother. She lived in the house adjacent to her sons on the same compound. The men informed her that there had been a break-in at the Glico factory. They needed access to her son's home to conduct an investigation. She let them in. They tied her up with a cut telephone line. They took the key to her son's house. At 9 p.m., Katsuhisa Izaki was bathing with his 2 youngest children. His wife, Mikiko, was elsewhere in the house with their eldest daughter. The 2 masked men entered through the unlocked door, located Mikiko and Mariko, and bound them with rope. Mikiko offered them money. One of the men responded, "Be quiet. Money is irrelevant." They found Katsuhisa in the bath, naked, with his 4-year-old daughter and 11-year-old son. They abducted him without allowing him to dress. They drove him to a warehouse in Ibaraki, Osaka, and secured him to a steel support column. At first, it didn't seem alarming. Kidnappings of wealthy executives were not uncommon in Japan during this period. The demands would come. The ransom would be negotiated. The victim would be released. But the demands did not come. For 3 days, Mr. Izaki sat on a concrete floor in near darkness. His captors did not mistreat him. They provided food purchased from the Dei supermarket chain. They addressed him politely. They expressed regret for the inconvenience. On the 3rd night, Mr. Izaki chewed through the rope binding his wrists. He waited until his captors fell asleep, crept to the warehouse door, found it unlocked, walked outside, flagged down a taxi, and went home. The kidnappers were never caught. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. The kidnappers had made no ransom demand. They had not contacted the family. They had not contacted the company. They had taken a wealthy executive, held him for 3 days, fed him, spoken to him politely, and then allowed him to escape from an unlocked warehouse. At the time, this was dismissed as incompetence. Amateur criminals who panicked when their victim escaped. Later, it would become impossible to ignore that the warehouse door was unlocked. The guards fell asleep simultaneously. Mr. Izaki was able to chew through his restraints, which were ordinary rope, and simply walk out. He was not supposed to escape. He was supposed to be released. Criminal psychologists who later studied the Monster with 21 Faces case focused on one behavioral detail: the letters. On April 8, 1984, 3 weeks after the kidnapping, a letter arrived at the police station. It was addressed to Japanese police fools. It read, "Are you stupid? There's so many of you, what on earth are you doing? If you are real pros, try catching me. There's too much handicap, so I will give you a hint. There's no fellows in the Izaki's relatives. There's no fellows in Nishinomiya police. There's no fellows in flood fighting corps. Car I used is gray, food was bought at Dei. If you want a new info, beg for it in the newspaper. After telling you all this, you should be able to catch me. If you don't, you are tax thieves. Shall I kidnap the head director of the prefectural police?" The letter was signed with 21 small faces, arranged in a circle. The Monster with 21 Faces had announced itself. This wasn't a ransom note. This was a performance. The Monster did not want money. The Monster wanted attention. On April 16th, a plastic container full of hydrochloric acid was found inside a Glico factory in Ibaraki. No damage was done. No one was harmed. On May 10th, the Monster sent its first letter directly to Glico. It claimed to have laced $21 million worth of Glico products with potassium cyanide. It threatened to place them on store shelves. None of these poison products were ever found. But Glico removed its products from stores nationwide. The company lost more than $20 million. 450 part-time workers were laid off. Total sales decreased by nearly $130 million. Then, on June 26th, the Monster sent another letter. "We forgive you. You have suffered enough. The Monster is not cruel. The Monster is not unreasonable. The Monster is satisfied. The harassment of Glico ceased." For 3 weeks, investigators allowed themselves to hope that the case had simply dissolved. The Monster had made no money. No one had been killed. Perhaps the perpetrator had grown bored, moved on, returned to an ordinary life. On June 22, 1984, a confectionery retailer in Tokyo received a package. Inside was a bag of Morinaga and Company caramels. Tucked beneath the candy was a handwritten note. "Dear Morinaga, how have you been?" Investigators focused their attention on 2 individuals. The first was known only as the videotaped man. A security camera at a Tokyo grocery store had captured a man wearing a Yomiuri Giants baseball cap placing Glico chocolate on a shelf. The photograph was grainy, the angle poor. He was never identified. The second was known as the fox-eyed man. On June 28, 1984, 2 days after the Monster agreed to stop harassing Marudai Ham in exchange for 50 million yen, police came within meters of capturing the suspected mastermind. An investigator disguised as a Marudai employee followed the Monster's instructions for a money exchange. As he rode a train toward the designated drop point, he noticed a man watching him. The man was large, well-built, wearing sunglasses with short, permed hair. His eyes, the investigator later testified, were like those of a fox. The investigator tailed him from train to train. The fox-eyed man eluded him. In a later incident, investigators saw the same man accompanying another suspected member of the monster group during a money exchange with House Food Corporation. Again, he escaped. On paper, one suspect made sense. Manabu Miyazaki, the son of a known Yakuza boss, bore a striking resemblance to both the videotaped man and the fox-eyed man. He had been involved in a labor dispute with Glico approximately 10 years earlier. He had the connections, the resources, the motive. But something didn't add up. Miyazaki's alibis were verified. He was cleared of involvement. Some investigators continued to suspect him, but no evidence ever emerged to support that suspicion. But the most disturbing part was still to come. On November 1, 1984, a threatening letter from the monster with 21 faces arrived at the Tokyo home of Morinaga Dairy Vice President Mitsuo Yamada. To President, "You saw our power, didn't you? If you disobey us, we will destroy your company. You will get killed. Decide whether you want to give us money or do you want to see your company destroyed. Tell us in the Mainichi newspaper on either the 5th or 6th of November. Use the missing persons." Use these words in the reply: Jiro, Morinaga, mother, police, bad friend, money, meal. As we said before, we want 200 million yen. Monster with 21 faces. Morinaga responded on November 6th by placing a missing persons advertisement in the Mainichi newspaper's morning edition. Dear Jiro, bad friend disappeared. Come back. Warm meal is waiting. Mother Chiyoko. This is where the story takes a darker turn. The monster understood the language of corporate Japan. It understood how to communicate with executives, how to structure ransom demands, how to negotiate through newspaper personal ads. It understood police procedure, forensic evidence, media dynamics. It was not a group of amateurs. It was not a single individual with a grudge. It was something else entirely. Everything changed on August 12, 1985. 5 days earlier, the police superintendent of Shiga Prefecture, Kenji Yamamoto, had died by self-immolation in an empty parking lot. He was 56 years old. He had led the investigation into the monster with 21 faces. He had come closer than anyone to identifying the perpetrator. On August 12th, the monster sent its final message to the media. Yamamoto of Shiga Prefecture Police died. How stupid of him. We've got no friends or secret hiding place in Shiga. It's Yoshino or Shikata who should have died. What have they been doing for as long as 1 year and 5 months? Don't let bad guys like us get away with it. There are many more fools who want to copy us. No career. Yamamoto died like a man. So we decided to give our condolence. We decided to forget about torturing food-making companies. If anyone blackmails any of the food-making companies, it's not us but someone copying us. We are bad guys. That means we've got more to do other than bullying companies. It's fun to lead a bad man's life. Monster with 21 faces. After this letter, the monster was never heard from again. The truth was far more calculated than anyone expected. The monster with 21 faces was not one person. It was not a criminal organization. It was not a political movement. It was, as near as investigators could determine after 11 years of failed pursuit, a performance. The perpetrator or perpetrators had demonstrated the ability to poison products, extort millions of yen, evade one of the largest police investigations in Japanese history, and disappear completely. They had operated for 18 months, taunted law enforcement in dozens of letters, come within meters of capture and escaped, and then, when the lead investigator took his own life in despair, they stopped. This wasn't a crime spree. This was a conversation. The statute of limitations for the kidnapping of Katsuhisa Izaki expired in June 1995. The statute of limitations for the attempted poisonings expired in February 2000. Over 1 million police officers had worked on the case in some capacity. They had chased more than 28,000 tips and investigated nearly 125,000 persons of interest. They had spent more money, man-hours, and institutional resources on this case than on any other in Japanese history. They never made an arrest. The monster with 21 faces case left behind more questions than answers. For Katsuhisa Izaki, the kidnapping was a wound that never fully healed. He retired from Glico in 1986. He rarely spoke publicly about his 3 days of captivity. When asked, he described his captors as polite and ordinary-looking. He died in 2005. For the families of the victims, Glico, Morinaga, Marudai Ham, House Food Corporation, the financial losses were eventually recovered. The reputational damage took longer. Japanese consumers did not immediately forget that their favorite candies had been used as weapons. For Superintendent Yamamoto's family, there was only the memory of a man who drove to an empty parking lot, doused himself in gasoline, and lit a match because he could not live with the knowledge that he had solved the case and still failed to make an arrest. The monster with 21 faces was never identified. The fox-eyed man was never caught. The letters stopped arriving. The statute of limitations expired. The case is closed. It is not solved. Case 4. The Istil Woman. Bergen, Norway, November 1970. The city is wrapped in the gray light of approaching winter. Rain falls frequently. Fog settles in the valleys. The mountains that surround the city disappear into low cloud for days at a time. On the morning of November 29th, a man and his 2 young daughters were hiking in the foothills of Ulriken, in an area known as Istillen, Ice Valley. It was also called, by locals who remembered medieval histories, Dodsdalen, Death Valley. They came across the body of a woman wedged between rocks in a remote area. She was lying on her back, her hands clenched near her torso. The front of her body and her clothes had been severely burned. Her face was unrecognizable. No one expected that Sunday morning to be different. No one expected to find a body. Bergen police responded quickly. They examined the site and cataloged the evidence. An empty bottle of St. Halvard liqueur, 2 plastic water bottles, a plastic passport holder, rubber boots, a woolen jumper, a scarf, nylon stockings, an umbrella, a purse, a matchbox, a watch, 2 earrings, a ring. Around the body were traces of burned paper. Beneath it was a fur hat later found to contain traces of petrol. All identifying marks on the items, labels, tags, serial numbers, had been removed or rubbed off. First, it didn't seem alarming. Unidentified bodies were not uncommon. Suicide was the obvious conclusion. The woman had ingested something, set herself on fire, and died in the remote valley. But 3 days later, investigators found 2 suitcases at Bergen railway station. They had been checked into storage and abandoned. Inside one suitcase, hidden in the lining, were 5 100 Deutsche Mark notes. Inside were clothing, shoes, wigs, makeup, eczema cream, 135 Norwegian kroner, coins from Belgium, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, maps, timetables, a pair of non-prescription glasses, and a notepad. All identification information had been removed from the items. The labels had been cut from the clothing. The serial numbers had been scraped from the currency. This is where the story takes a darker turn. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. The notepad contained a series of coded entries, dates, times, letters, numbers. When police finally cracked the code, they discovered it was a record of the woman's travels. She had been moving through Norway and Europe for months, possibly years, under at least 8 different aliases. Genevieve Lancier, born in Leuven, living in Brussels. Claudia Tielt, born in Brussels, living in Brussels. Claudia Nielsen, born in Ghent, living in Brussels. Alexia Zarnmerches, born in Ljubljana, living in Brussels. Vera Jarl, born in Antwerp. Penella Lorck. Elizabeth Lienhauer, born in Ostend, living in Brussels. All of the addresses she provided on hotel registration forms were false. With one exception, the street names did not exist. The exception was Rue de la Madeleine in Brussels, but the building number she provided corresponded to a commercial property, not a residence. At the time, these multiple identities were dismissed as eccentricity, a woman who valued her privacy, perhaps fleeing an unhappy marriage or difficult circumstances. Later, it would become impossible to ignore that she had also removed the labels from her clothing, sanded the serial numbers from her personal effects, and, the autopsy revealed, deliberately abraded her own fingerprints. This wasn't privacy. This was erasure. Criminal psychologists who later studied the Istel woman case focused on one behavioral detail: the wigs. Multiple witnesses who encountered the woman during her travels described her hair as dark brown, shoulder length, and neatly styled. But the suitcases recovered from the railway station contained several wigs of different colors and lengths. Hotel staff who had seen her on different occasions gave conflicting descriptions of her appearance. She was not merely concealing her identity. She was performing different identities. This wasn't paranoia. This was tradecraft. Everything changed when investigators interviewed a sea captain named Kettle Kversoy. In 2005, 35 years after the Istel woman's death, Kversoy came forward to report an encounter he had never forgotten. He was 26 years old in 1970, an experienced hiker familiar with the trails around Bergen. 5 days before the body was discovered, he was hiking on the hillside at Fløyen, a popular vantage point overlooking the city. He saw a woman walking ahead of him. She was dressed in city clothes, not hiking attire, and appeared hesitant, as if uncertain of her direction. Approximately 65 feet behind her, 2 men in coats were following at a steady pace. They looked, Kversoy said, Southern, his term for foreign, Mediterranean, not Norwegian. The woman noticed Kversoy. Their eyes met. Her expression, he later testified, was scared and giving up. She seemed about to speak to him. Then she glanced back at the men following her, lowered her head, and continued walking. Kversoy went to the police. He described what he had seen. He was told to forget about it. His report was never recorded. His name was never entered into the case file. For 35 years, his testimony existed only in his memory. Investigators focused their attention on espionage. The year was 1970. The Cold War was at its peak. Norway was a NATO member sharing a border with the Soviet Union. Bergen was a port city with strategic military significance. The Istel woman's movements, decoded from her notepad, corresponded with the testing locations of the Penguin missile, Norway's top-secret naval strike weapon. On paper, it made sense. A woman with multiple passports, multiple aliases, documented travel to military testing sites, evidence of counter-surveillance tradecraft. She was a spy. She was murdered by her handlers. The men in coats followed her, caught up with her in Istelen, forced her to ingest sleeping pills, burned her body to destroy evidence, and disappeared. But something didn't add up. If she was a spy, why was she so visible? Why did she register at hotels under false names but provide handwriting samples, interact with staff, leave physical traces? Why did she carry coded notes in an unlocked suitcase? Why did she remove her labels and sand her fingerprints, but leave her dental work intact, unique enough that forensic odontologists could later trace her origins to a specific region of Germany? Intelligence operatives do not leave dental records. But the most disturbing part was still to come. In 2017, stable isotope analysis of the Istel woman's teeth provided answers that only deepened the mystery. She was born in approximately 1930, plus or minus 4 years, in or near Nuremberg, Germany. During childhood, she moved to France or the French-German border region. Her dental work indicated she had visited a dentist in either East Asia, Central Europe, Southern Europe, or South America. The analysis could not narrow it further. She was approximately 40 years old at the time of her death. She had lived at least 3 distinct lives: a childhood in wartime Germany, a youth in post-war France, and an adulthood of constant, unexplained movement across Europe. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Her mitochondrial DNA haplogroup was H24, a lineage originating in Southeast Europe or Southwest Asia. She was not, as investigators had long assumed, ethnically Norwegian or even Northern European. Her maternal ancestors came from the Eastern Mediterranean, thousands of years and thousands of miles away. The truth is that there is no truth. Not yet. The Istel woman was buried on February 5, 1971, in an unmarked grave at Melendal Cemetery in Bergen. 16 members of the Bergen police force attended her funeral. She was interred in a zinc coffin, not for any symbolic reason, but to preserve her remains in case relatives ever came forward to claim her. No one ever came. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned. But the question remains, whose plan? The Norwegian police officially ruled her death a suicide. The combination of barbiturates and carbon monoxide, the self-immolation, the isolated location, all consistent with a woman who had decided to end her life. But the bruise on her neck, the unidentified men following her on the trail, the missing taxi driver who took her from her hotel to the train station and was never located, the anonymous taxi driver who came forward in 1991 to say that another man had joined them for that ride. The case was reopened in 2016. Forensic geneticists offered to analyze the preserved tissues using modern DNA sequencing. The BBC and NRK produced a podcast, Death in Ice Valley, that reached millions of listeners and generated hundreds of tips. The woman's face was reconstructed, sketched, circulated through Interpol channels across Europe. She remains unidentified. She remains unclaimed. She remains, 53 years after her death, the most profound cold case mystery in Norwegian history. The Istel woman case left behind more questions than answers. For the Bergen police officers who attended her funeral, the case became a private burden. Several spoke of her in interviews decades later, always off the record, always with the same qualification: we should have done more. For the Norwegian intelligence services, the case remains officially closed but unofficially active. Declassified documents reveal that the Istel woman's movements intersected with multiple classified military installations. Whether she was observing them or merely passing through has never been determined. For the amateur investigators, podcast listeners, and internet sleuths who have taken up the case in recent years, the Istel woman has become something she never was in life. A known figure, a subject of speculation, a character in a story she did not choose to tell. In death, she has acquired what she so carefully avoided in life: identity. But not her own. Case 5. The Jagse case. Anshausen, West Germany, October 1984. A village of perhaps 600 people in the region of Siegen-Wittgenstein. Farming families, commuters to the nearby industrial cities. A pub called Papillon where local men gathered after work. Gunther Stoll lived here with his wife. He was 32 years old, an unemployed food engineer. By all accounts, his life was ordinary. He had trained in a profession, married, settled in the village where he grew up. He was quiet, perhaps slightly anxious, but not unusual. No one expected that October night to be different. On the evening of October 25, 1984, at approximately 10:45 p.m., Gunther Stoll was sitting at the kitchen table. His wife was preparing for bed. They had spent the evening in their usual routine: dinner, television, quiet conversation. Stoll had been speaking in fragments for months. He referred to those Denen in German, unknown persons who, he believed, intended to harm him. He did not explain who they were or why they wanted to harm him. He did not provide names, dates, locations, or any concrete details. His wife listened, nodded, and attributed his anxiety to unemployment and the stress of an uncertain future. At 10:45 p.m., Stoll sat upright. His expression changed. He said, "Jetzt get mir an Licht auf. Now I've got it." He picked up a pen. He wrote 6 characters on a sheet of paper. His wife saw him write. She did not see what he wrote. Not clearly, not in a way she could later recall with certainty. She saw 6 characters, possibly letters and numbers, possibly a combination. She saw him cross them out immediately, so forcefully that the pen tore the paper. Then he stood, walked to the door, and drove away in his Volkswagen Golf. At first, it didn't seem alarming. He had been under stress. He had spoken cryptically before. Perhaps he needed air, time alone, a drive to clear his head. He did not return. At approximately 3 a.m. on October 26th, 2 truck drivers on the A45 Autobahn near the Hagensud exit noticed a car in the trench adjacent to the roadway. They pulled over to investigate. The car was a VW Golf, registered to Gunther Stoll. It had sustained damage consistent with a high-speed exit from the roadway. The drivers called law enforcement. While waiting for police to arrive, they noticed an injured person in a white jacket walking near the car. This person was never identified. When police arrived, they found Gunther Stoll naked in the passenger seat of his own car. He was severely injured, conscious, and able to speak. He told the officers that he had been with 4 men. He said the men were not his friends. He died on the way to the hospital. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. Stoll's injuries were not consistent with a car accident. The damage to his vehicle was minor. The car had left the road at relatively low speed and settled into a trench. But Stoll's body showed evidence of having been struck by a vehicle at a different location. He had been injured elsewhere, then transported to the crash site and placed in the passenger seat. Furthermore, he was naked. His clothes were never recovered. At the time, this was dismissed as confusion. Perhaps he had removed his own clothing in a state of delirium, wandered from the crash site, been struck by another vehicle, and returned to his car. Later, it would become impossible to ignore that his injuries and the damage to his car did not match. He was hit somewhere else. He was undressed somewhere else. He was placed in his own car and driven to the Autobahn exit by someone else. 6 months after Gunther Stoll's death, his wife came forward with information she had not previously disclosed. The piece of paper, the 6 characters, the crossed-out writing that she had not understood and had, in her grief and confusion, thrown away. She did not know the exact combination. She thought it was YOGTZE, or perhaps YOGTZE, or perhaps YO6TZE. She could not be certain. The paper was gone. The moment had passed. Investigators had no physical evidence. They had only her memory, and her memory was not reliable enough to serve as the foundation for a criminal investigation. Criminal psychologists who later studied the YOGTZ case focused on one behavioral detail. The phrase, "Jetzt geht mir ein Licht auf," is not a casual expression in German. It is not equivalent to, "I've got an idea," or "now I understand." It is a moment of revelation, the sudden illumination of something previously obscure, the instant when disparate pieces of information resolve into a coherent picture. Stoll had been afraid of those for months. He had spoken vaguely, obsessively, without resolution. Then, at 10:45 p.m. on October 25, 1984, resolution arrived. This wasn't paranoia. This was pattern recognition. Something he saw, heard, or remembered connected to something else. The connection was sudden, complete, and, based on what happened in the following 4 hours, deadly. Investigators focused their attention on Stoll's holiday trips to the Netherlands. He had traveled there several times in the months before his death. On paper, it made sense. The Netherlands in the 1980s was a transit point for narcotics. Perhaps Stoll had encountered drug dealers, witnessed something he should not have, become entangled in a criminal network. But something didn't add up. Stoll had no history of drug use. No drugs were found in his system during the autopsy. No drug paraphernalia was found in his home or vehicle. His contacts in the Netherlands, such as they could be identified, were ordinary vacation acquaintances with no criminal connections. The drug theory was abandoned. Everything changed on April 12, 1985. The YOGTZE case was presented on Aktenzeichen XY, Ungelöst, West Germany's most popular true crime television program. Millions of viewers watched the reconstruction, heard the details of Stoll's final night, saw the 6 characters, YOGTZE, displayed on screen. Several amateur radio enthusiasts called the station. They pointed out that if you changed the G to a 6, you got YO6TZE, the official call sign of a Romanian radio station. The significance of this connection has never been determined. Stoll was not a radio enthusiast. He had no known connection to Romania. The Cold War was ongoing. Romania was a Warsaw Pact nation, officially hostile to West Germany. Was YOGTZ a code? A frequency? A coordinates? A name? No one knows. But the most disturbing part was still to come. The woman Stoll visited in Hager-Seelbach at approximately 1 a.m., the childhood acquaintance who advised him to go to his parents' house, later told investigators that Stoll mentioned a horrible incident, which was about to take place this night. He did not describe the incident. He did not name the individuals involved. He did not explain why he believed it was about to happen. He said only that his parents wouldn't understand him. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Stoll left Hager-Seelbach at approximately 1:30 a.m. He told the woman he would return to his wife in Anshausen. Instead, he drove 100 kilometers north to the A45 Autobahn near Hagensud. He did not explain why. He did not tell anyone he was going there. His body was discovered at approximately 3 a.m. Between 1:30 a.m. and 3 a.m., Gunther Stoll encountered the 4 men he mentioned to the truck drivers and police. He was struck by a vehicle, stripped of his clothing, and placed in the passenger seat of his own car. His car was driven to the Autobahn exit and positioned to appear as if it had crashed. Someone wanted his death to look like an accident. Someone wanted the investigation to focus on the crash site, not the location where he was actually injured. Someone knew that the piece of paper with the 6 characters existed, and that his wife, in grief and confusion, had already thrown it away. The truth is that there is no truth. Not yet. The YOGTZ case has never been solved. No suspect has ever been identified. The 4 men Stoll mentioned, not his friends, have never been located. The person in the white jacket seen walking near the crash site has never been identified. The hitchhiker reported by other drivers at the Hagensud exit that night has never been found. The meaning of YOGTZE, or YOGTZE, or YO6TZE remains unknown. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned. But whose plan? And why? The YOGTZ case left behind more questions than answers. For Stoll's wife, the burden of the missing paper became a lifelong grief. She had held the only physical evidence of her husband's final revelation in her hands. She had thrown it away. She could not forgive herself. For the investigators who worked the case, the YOGTZ letters became an obsession. Decades after Stoll's death, retired detectives continued to pursue leads, examine theories, speculate about the meaning of those 6 characters. None of their efforts produced results. For the amateur sleuths, internet researchers, and true crime enthusiasts who have taken up the case in recent years, YOGTZE has become a cipher. A mystery that exists not to be solved but to be contemplated. 40 years later, the case files remain open. The statute of limitations for murder in Germany does not expire. Gunther Stoll's killer or killers are still alive, or their children are, or their records exist somewhere in an archive not yet examined. The answer to the riddle of YOGTZ exists. It is simply not yet found. Do you believe these crimes were driven by emotion or intent? In the Salish Sea, the intent was nature itself. Tide, scavenger, buoyancy. Producing a pattern that looked like predation but was actually inevitability. Was the real failure not the investigation but our expectation that every pattern must have a perpetrator? In Cape Elizabeth, the intruder left no evidence of malice. He took nothing, damaged nothing, harmed no one. What do we call a crime when the only victim is the memory of a stranger's face hovering in the dark? And if that man is still alive, still living an ordinary life in an ordinary town, has he stopped watching, or have we simply stopped noticing him? In Osaka, the monster with 21 faces could have killed. Chose not to. Could have taken millions. It walked away. It engaged in an 18-month conversation with Japanese law enforcement and then, when the conversation became too costly, ended it. Was this terrorism, extortion, performance, or something else entirely? In Bergen, the Istel woman erased herself so completely that even now, 53 years after her death, we do not know her name. Was she a spy, a victim, a woman fleeing a past she could not outrun? And if the men in coats were following her, why did they wait until she reached Death Valley? In West Germany, Gunther Stoll wrote 6 characters on a sheet of paper, crossed them out, and drove into a night that ended his life. What did he see in that moment of illumination? What pattern resolved itself so completely that he knew he had to leave immediately? And who were the 4 men who were not his friends? What do you think investigators missed in each of these cases? If you're interested in the psychology and stories behind real crimes, the cases that investigators closed but never solved, the perpetrators who walked away and never returned, the evidence that sits in storage rooms waiting for questions that may never come, subscribe to Behind the Crime Files.